The square is under fire. Gunshots echo off the facades of buildings that line the Champs-Élysées. Small arms mostly, rifles, submachine guns, the occasional burst from a light machine gun positioned somewhere out of sight. The firing comes in bursts, then stops, then starts again from a different direction. A German Panther tank sits at the eastern edge of Place de la Concorde, hull angled toward the Tuileries Gardens. The turret is traversing slowly, tracking movement that most observers can't see. Engine running, exhaust creating a heat shimmer in the afternoon sun. The crew is buttoned up, all hatches closed. They're not taking chances. The obelisk of Luxor stands in the center of the square, 3,300 years old, transported from Egypt in the 1830s. Right now, it's providing cover for French resistance fighters who are using it to shield themselves from German fire positions in the ministry buildings to the north. Cobblestones have been torn up and stacked into makeshift barricades at 3 of the square's entrances. A Kubelwagen is burning near the fountain basin, thick black smoke climbing straight up in the still air. The Arc de Triomphe is visible at the western end of the Champs-Élysées, 2 kilometers up the avenue. From this distance, it's just a dark shape against the sky. Between the Arc and Place de la Concorde, the street is mostly empty. A few abandoned vehicles, some debris from broken barricades, no civilians. Anyone with sense is inside, away from the windows. Rifle fire cracks from a rooftop somewhere on the Rue de Rivoli. The rounds spark off the Panther's armour, small caliber, ineffective against 45 tons of tank. The crew inside probably can't even hear them over the engine noise, but they know the city has turned hostile. Police stations seized by their own officers 2 days ago. Barricades going up across major intersections, German patrols being ambushed in broad daylight. A column of smoke rises from somewhere near the Seine. Another fire, another burned vehicle or building. The sound of the city is wrong, sporadic gunfire instead of traffic, shouting instead of conversation. Paris has been occupied for 4 years. Now it's tearing itself apart. The Panther isn't moving. It's been in position for at least an hour, maybe longer. Just sitting there, engine idling, turret traversing occasionally, waiting. The crew knows something is coming. They just don't know what or when. Question: why is a Panther tank from an elite armoured division sitting alone in the centre of Paris during an urban uprising? To answer that, you have to go back 8 weeks. Panzer Lehr was formed in late 1943 as a demonstration unit. The name translates as Armoured Instruction or Armoured Demonstration. It was built around a specific concept. Take the instructor staff from Germany's armoured warfare schools and organise them into a full division. Every tank commander had been a teacher. Every platoon leader had trained other soldiers. The formation was designed to be a showcase of German armoured doctrine executed by the men who literally wrote the training manuals. The division's first commander was General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein. He'd served as Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, then commanded the German Africa Corps after Rommel was recalled. He knew armoured warfare at the operational level. When he took command of Panzer Lehr in January 1944, he inherited approximately 14,000 men and 190 tanks. Better equipment than most divisions received in 1944. The personnel roster read like a who's who of German armoured warfare experience. Officers who'd fought in Poland, France, Russia. Tank crews who'd been instructing at Panzertruppenschule facilities before being mobilised. NCOs with years of combat experience who'd been pulled from the front to teach, now being sent back to the front as a formed unit. This wasn't a scratch formation. It was Germany's attempt to concentrate expertise. The division structure included 2 Panzer Grenadier regiments for mechanised infantry, the 130th Panzer Regiment with 2 battalions of tanks, the 130th Panzer Artillery Regiment, plus reconnaissance, engineer, anti-aircraft and support units. Everything a modern armoured division needed to operate independently. Equipment was first-rate by 1944 standards, optics were new, radios actually worked. The half-tracks that carried the Panzer Grenadiers were mostly SDKFZ 251S, not captured French trucks. Even the supply situation was better than average, at least at the start. Panzer Lehr finished training in France in early 1944. They conducted exercises near Verdun, practiced coordination between armour and infantry, rehearsed the kind of mobile operations that German doctrine emphasised. They were as ready as any division in the Wehrmacht could be in 1944, which meant they were about to be thrown into a situation where readiness wouldn't matter. The Allied invasion of Normandy began on June 6, 1944. Panzer Lehr was stationed inland around the Chartres area, too far from the beaches to intervene on D-Day itself. They received movement orders on June 7th and began the approach march toward the invasion front. This took longer than planned. Allied air superiority meant movement during daylight was suicide. The division moved at night, hiding during the day, losing vehicles to breakdowns and air attack. They reached the front on June 9th and were immediately committed near Tilly-sur-Seulles. The British were pushing south from their landing beaches, trying to take Caen. Panzer Lehr's mission was to stop them. The division moved into positions in the bocage, that Norman hedgerow country, where every field was bordered by earthen banks thick with vegetation. Perfect defensive terrain, terrible for armoured manoeuvre. The fighting at Tilly was brutal and inconclusive. British tanks, mostly Shermans and Cromwells, pushed against German defensive positions. Panzer Lehr counterattacked when they saw openings. The town changed hands multiple times over several days. Tank losses on both sides were significant. The British had the advantage of being able to replace their losses. Panzer Lehr didn't. What's notable about this period is not the tactical details but the pattern it established. Panzer Lehr was being used as a fire brigade. Crisis at Tilly, send Panzer Lehr, British breakthrough threatening near Caen, shift Panzer Lehr east, American pressure building in the west, pull elements of Panzer Lehr to reinforce. This is not how elite armoured divisions are supposed to be employed. German doctrine emphasised concentration of force at the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point. You mass your armour, punch through enemy lines, exploit the breakthrough, create operational chaos in the enemy rear. Defensive fighting in the bocage, reacting to Allied initiatives, plugging gaps, this was the opposite of what Panzer Lehr had been designed to do. But by June 1944, German forces in Normandy didn't have the luxury of dictating terms. Allied air supremacy made large-scale German counteroffensives impossible. Any concentration of armour attracted fighter bombers. Daytime movement was restricted. Radio intercepts gave the Allies warning of German intentions. The Wehrmacht in Normandy was reduced to defensive warfare, trying to hold a perimeter while waiting for reinforcements that weren't coming, or a negotiated peace that wasn't happening. Panzer Lehr fought in this situation for 6 weeks. From early June through late July, they were continuously engaged. The division was shifted from sector to sector, fighting wherever the situation was most critical. They lost tanks to combat, to mechanical breakdown, to Allied air attack. Personnel casualties mounted. The replacement system provided new men and some equipment, but never enough to offset losses. By mid-July, Panzer Lehr had been reduced to roughly half strength, maybe 90 to 100 operational tanks. Infantry battalions were under strength. The constant movement and combat had worn down equipment and men. They were still combat effective, still dangerous, but they weren't the showcase division that had arrived in Normandy 6 weeks earlier. Then came Operation Cobra. Operation Cobra was the American breakout operation in the western sector of the Normandy front. The concept was straightforward. Use heavy bombers to obliterate a section of German defensive line, then punch through with armour before the Germans could recover. The target area was a rectangular box south of the Perrier-Saint-Lô road, roughly 5 kilometers wide and 2 kilometers deep. Panzer Lehr Division held positions within this box. The bombing began at 0938 hours on July 25th. First came fighter bombers, P-47 Thunderbolts, and P-38 Lightnings, attacking German positions with bombs and rockets. Then medium bombers, B-26 Marauders and A-20 Havocs. Then the heavies, 1,507 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators from the 8th Air Force dropped approximately 3,300 tons of high explosive and fragmentation bombs on the target area. The bombing lasted about an hour. The bombs were supposed to fall south of the Perrier-Saint-Lô road. Some fell north of it into American positions. The 30th Infantry Division took casualties from short bombing, but most of the ordnance went where intended, into Panzer Lehr's positions. There's no adequate description of what strategic bombing does to ground forces. The explosions create overpressure waves that rupture organs. The fragmentation tears through anything not protected by heavy cover. Direct hits on armoured vehicles destroy them completely, turrets blown off, hulls cracked open. Near misses bury vehicles under tons of earth or flip them over. The noise is continuous and overwhelming, making communication impossible. Fritz Bayerlein was at his divisional command post when the bombing started. The command post was hit multiple times. Staff officers were killed. Radio equipment was destroyed. Communications with subordinate units ceased within the first 15 minutes of the attack. Bayerlein survived, but lost contact with most of his division. The damage was catastrophic, approximately 70% personnel casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Roughly 30 to 50 tanks destroyed or damaged beyond repair. Complete breakdown of the communications network. Dispersal of surviving units across the target area with no coordination possible. Bayerlein's report to 7th Army Headquarters stated, "My front-line division is annihilated, only small remnants exist. Several tanks were thrown about like toys by the blast." This was not hyperbole. Panzer Lehr as a coherent fighting formation had ceased to exist. Individual companies and platoons might still be combat capable if they'd escaped the worst of the bombing, but there was no division-level command structure, no communications, no coordinated defense. When American armor and infantry advanced later that day, they met scattered resistance from whatever German units had survived, but there was no continuous defensive line. The Americans broke through. Armored columns pushed south and east, exploiting the gap. Other German units on either side of where Panzer Lehr had been were now exposed. The entire western sector of the Normandy front began to collapse. Bayerlein gathered what survivors he could find over the next 48 hours. Maybe 2,000 men, perhaps a dozen operational tanks, some artillery pieces. This Kampfgruppe, this battle group, continued to fight as the Americans exploited their breakthrough, but they were fighting as stragglers, not as a division. By early August, the Allied plan was to encircle and destroy German forces in Normandy. American forces had broken out at Avranches and were swinging north and east. British and Canadian forces were attacking south. The jaws were closing on multiple German armies trapped in a pocket around the town of Falaise. Hitler ordered a counterattack west toward Avranches to cut off the American forces that had broken through. This was Operation Lüttich. It committed Germany's remaining armoured reserves in Normandy to an attack that senior commanders on the ground knew was impossible. The attack failed. The tanks committed to Lüttich were now trapped deeper inside the forming pocket. What remained of Panzer Lehr was somewhere in this chaos. Bayerlein had managed to keep some unit cohesion, but the division existed more as a collection of small groups than as an organised formation. They were retreating east with thousands of other German troops, trying to escape the pocket before it closed completely. The Falaise Pocket in mid-August 1944 was a killing ground. Allied artillery had pre-registered fire on all the main roads and crossroads. Fighter bombers flew continuous sorties against any movement they spotted. The roads were clogged with retreating columns, trucks, horse-drawn wagons, walking infantry, a few remaining tanks. When Allied aircraft attacked these columns, there was nowhere to disperse to. Vehicles burned, horses panicked, men died or were wounded and left behind. The gap between Allied forces closed slowly, then rapidly. German units tried to break out through the narrowing openings. Some made it, most didn't. The fields around Falaise were littered with destroyed vehicles, dead horses, abandoned equipment. Post-battle counts estimated 10,000 German dead in the pocket and 50,000 captured. Bayerlein got out with perhaps 500 men and a handful of vehicles. The division's colours survived. The organisational structure on paper survived. But Panzer Lehr Division as a fighting force had been destroyed. First at Operation Cobra, then finished in the Falaise Pocket. The survivors retreated east toward the Seine. German engineers had prepared demolitions on the Seine bridges to delay Allied pursuit. Some units crossed before the bridges were blown. Others had to swim or find boats. Equipment was abandoned on the west bank. What had been an army retreated as fragments. Some of those fragments reached Paris. Paris in August 1944 was not a fortress city. It wasn't heavily garrisoned. The German military presence was mostly administrative. Headquarters staff, logistics units, occupation troops whose job was maintaining order rather than fighting. The actual combat strength of German forces in Paris was limited. But as the front collapsed in Normandy and Allied forces advanced east, Paris suddenly became relevant again. The city sat on the Seine, which represented a potential defensive line. The rail yards were important for moving supplies and troops, and politically, Paris was Paris. Holding it mattered symbolically, even if the strategic situation was hopeless. German High Command began reinforcing the Paris garrison in mid-August. These weren't fresh divisions. They were remnants from Normandy. Stragglers who'd escaped the Falaise Pocket, training battalions, Luftwaffe ground personnel, whatever could be scraped together. Some armoured vehicles made it to the city, a few Panthers, some Panzer IVs, perhaps some Stug assault guns. The exact numbers are unclear, because record-keeping had broken down along with everything else. It's probable that some of the Panthers that reached Paris came from Panzer Lehr's remnants. The chain of custody is murky because unit records from this period are incomplete or lost, but fragments of Panzer Lehr's 131st Panzer Regiment were definitely in the Paris area in late August. Whether the specific Panther at Place Concord was technically assigned to Panzer Lehr or to some other unit is impossible to determine definitively. What matters is that it represented the same thing: elite German armour at the end of its run. The German military governor of Paris was General Dietrich von Choltitz. He'd been appointed to the position on August 7th with orders from Hitler to hold the city and, if necessary, destroy it rather than let it fall intact to the Allies. Demolition charges were prepared on bridges across the Seine. Additional charges were placed on major monuments and government buildings. The plan was comprehensive: turn Paris into rubble if it couldn't be held. Von Choltitz was a professional soldier, not a Nazi ideologue. He'd commanded infantry and armoured units on the Eastern Front. He understood military realities. Looking at Paris in mid-August 1944, he could see that the city couldn't be held. German forces were insufficient. Allied armies were approaching. There was no strategic depth to fall back to. The question wasn't whether Paris would fall, but how. Meanwhile, the French resistance in Paris was preparing an uprising. Multiple resistance networks existed in the city. Communist groups, Gaullist groups, various independent organizations. They'd been conducting sabotage and intelligence gathering for years. Now, they were planning to take action before Allied forces arrived. The goal was to liberate Paris themselves, to demonstrate that France had liberated its own capital, rather than waiting passively to be rescued. The uprising began on August 19th. Paris police, who'd largely collaborated with the occupation for 4 years, went on strike, then seized their own police stations. Resistance fighters occupied government buildings. Barricades went up across major streets. Shots were fired at German patrols. Within hours, the city was in partial revolt. The German response was confused. Von Choltitz had perhaps 20,000 troops, many of them rear echelon personnel not trained for urban combat. He could order reprisals and did in some cases, but suppressing a citywide uprising with limited forces was impossible. He had armoured vehicles, but tanks in cities are vulnerable to close-range attack from above and from the sides. He had orders to destroy Paris if it couldn't be held, but actually executing those orders would require time and organisation he didn't have. The situation stalemated. Germans held some areas, resistance held others, control was contested in between. Sporadic firefights erupted and died down, German snipers on rooftops, resistance fighters using buildings for cover, civilians caught in the middle, hiding in apartments, waiting to see who'd win. This went on for 5 days. August 19th through August 23rd, the city tearing itself apart in slow motion while Allied forces approached from the west and south. On August 24th, advanced elements of the French 2nd Division, Blindé, 2nd Armoured Division, entered Paris from the south and west. This was General Philippe Leclerc's division, Free French forces that had fought in North Africa and Italy, now equipped with American Sherman tanks and M10 Wolverine tank destroyers. They'd been given the honour of liberating Paris ahead of American and British units. This was a political decision as much as a military one. Paris would be liberated by French forces, or at least appear to be. Leclerc's division moved into the city cautiously. They were entering a built-up area with German forces of unknown strength still resisting. Street fighting is dangerous. Tanks are vulnerable. Buildings provide cover for infantry with anti-tank weapons. The French advanced slowly, clearing sectors, securing key intersections, coordinating with resistance fighters who knew the city's layout. German strongpoints fought back where they could, machine gun positions in buildings, snipers on rooftops, and armoured vehicles at key locations. One of those locations was Place de la Concorde. The Panther at Place de la Concorde on the afternoon of August 24th was in a bad tactical position. The square was open, providing little cover. Barricades blocked some approaches, but wouldn't stop tank fire. Resistance fighters controlled buildings on multiple sides. The crew had to know they were isolated, no infantry support visible, no other German armour nearby. Radio communication was probably sporadic at best, but the tank was still dangerous. A Panther's 75mm KWK-42 gun could destroy any Allied tank at combat ranges. Its frontal armour was thick enough to resist most anti-tank weapons the Resistance possessed. As long as the crew stayed buttoned up and kept the engine running, they could dominate the square and the approaches to it. Near the Arc de Triomphe, roughly 1800 metres up the Champs-Élysées, a French M10 Wolverine tank destroyer had positioned itself. The M10 was an American-designed vehicle, open-topped, lightly armoured, mounting a high-velocity 76mm gun. It wasn't a tank, it was designed specifically to kill tanks. The crew was French, veterans of Leclerc's division, who'd fought their way from North Africa through Sicily and Italy to reach this moment. The range was extreme for tank warfare. Most engagements in Normandy had been fought at ranges under 1,000 metres, often much less. The bocage didn't allow for long sight lines. But here, on the Champs-Élysées, the gunner had a clear view straight down that wide boulevard to where the Panther sat at Place de la Concorde. The Arc de Triomphe provided some cover for the M10. The Panther crew probably knew something was up there, but couldn't get a clean shot without exposing themselves to fire from other directions. The French gunner calculated the shot, 1800 metres, wind minimal, target stationary but partially hull down behind some debris. The M10's 76mm gun had the velocity to reach that range, but actually hitting a target that small at that distance required skill and luck. He fired. The round took roughly 3 seconds to cover the distance, long enough for the sound of the gun to reach the Panther before the impact. The shell struck somewhere on the Panther's frontal armour. The exact hit location isn't recorded. What's known is that the tank was damaged. Either the round penetrated or the impact caused internal damage, or the hit destroyed part of the suspension or running gear. The Panther stopped moving, engine still running, but the tank was immobilized. Smoke began coming from the vehicle, not heavy smoke yet, just exhaust mixing with whatever was burning inside or underneath. The crew was still inside. They had to decide, stay in a disabled tank in the middle of an open square, or bail out and try to escape on foot through a hostile city. Before they could decide, other French armoured vehicles were moving into the square. Sherman tanks from Leclerc's division, more M10s, armoured cars. Resistance fighters were advancing from the buildings, using the approaching armour as cover. The situation for the Panther crew had gone from bad to impossible in under a minute. An M8, Greyhound armoured car, commanded by Sergeant Marcel Bizien, accelerated across the square toward the immobilised Panther. Bizien was a veteran. He'd fought in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, Normandy. He'd survived years of combat to reach Paris, his own capital, and now he was going to ram a German tank with a vehicle that weighed maybe 8 tons against the Panther's 45. The decision made no tactical sense. Ramming a Panther with an armoured car wouldn't destroy it. At best, it might damage the vehicle further or prevent the crew from escaping. At worst, it would disable Bizien's own vehicle and leave him exposed. But tactics and logic operate differently when you're fighting in your own city, when you can see familiar buildings and streets you grew up with, when every German soldier represents 4 years of occupation. Bizien hit the Panther at speed. The armoured car's front end crumpled. The impact rocked the tank but didn't penetrate its armour or cause obvious additional damage. Bizien's vehicle was disabled, stuck against the Panther's hull. He was now in the most dangerous position possible, immobile, exposed, directly next to an enemy tank. Then the white phosphorus rounds arrived. Multiple hits, probably from French Sherman tanks or M10s that had now gotten into firing positions around the square. White phosphorus burns at extreme temperatures on contact with air. It produces thick white smoke and flame that sticks to whatever it touches. When white phosphorus hits an armoured vehicle, the chemical burns through vision ports and hatches, fills the interior with toxic smoke, and creates temperatures inside the crew compartment that are rapidly fatal. The Panther's crew knew they had seconds to evacuate. Hatches were thrown open. Men scrambled out, dropping to the ground, trying to get clear of the burning tank. They didn't make it far. Small arms fire from multiple directions cut them down. Resistance fighters firing from buildings. French troops firing from behind their armoured vehicles. The crew of the Panther, survivors of Normandy and Operation Cobra, and the long retreat across France, died on the cobblestones of Place de la Concorde, or were captured attempting to surrender. Marcel Bizien was hit by small arms fire. The circumstances are unclear from surviving accounts. It might have been German fire from another defensive position. It might have been crossfire from the chaos of the engagement. He was pulled from his disabled armoured car by his crew. He died later that day, either in the square or at an aid station. He'd fought for years to reach Paris and died in its liberation. The Panther burned for hours. White phosphorus is persistent. The smoke turned the afternoon air thick and acrid. French troops secured the square. Resistance fighters approached the burning tank cautiously, weapons ready, checking for survivors or threats. There were none. The tank was a wreck. The crew was dead or captured. The engagement was over. The destruction of that single Panther at Place de la Concorde represented something larger than one disabled tank. It was the final death of Panzer Lehr Division. Not literally, the division would be reconstituted later and thrown into the Battle of the Bulge in December. But symbolically, this was the end. The instructors from Germany's tank schools, the men who'd written the manuals on armoured warfare, the veterans who'd trained entire generations of panzer crews, were gone. They'd been destroyed methodically. First worn down in 6 weeks of defensive fighting in Normandy, shifted from crisis point to crisis point, used as a fire brigade when they'd been designed for offensive operations, then annihilated at Operation Cobra by strategic bombing that made their expertise irrelevant. What survived was scattered in the Falaise Pocket, the survivors retreating east as fragments rather than as a coherent unit. The handful who reached Paris ended up fighting in exactly the kind of situation their training had taught them to avoid. Static defense in an urban environment with no support, no communication, no possibility of reinforcement. Fritz Bayerlein survived the war. He gathered remnants of Panzer Lehr and led them through the retreat across France into Germany. The division was partially rebuilt with replacement personnel and equipment and committed to the Ardennes offensive in December 1944. That attack failed. Panzer Lehr fought in the defense of Germany through early 1945, surrendered to American forces in April. Bayerlein was captured, interrogated by Allied intelligence, eventually released. He died in 1970. Whatever he thought about the destruction of his division, about watching Germany's armoured elite consumed in battles they couldn't win, isn't recorded in detail. The Panther at Place de la Concorde was eventually towed away, cut up for scrap or salvaged for parts. No memorial marks the location. The square looks much as it did in 1944, the obelisk still standing, the fountain still functioning, tourists walking across the same cobblestones where the tank burned and men died. The specific details of the engagement were recorded in French military reports and a few memoir accounts, but the broader story, the death of Panzer Lehr and what it represented, became a footnote in histories that focused on larger operations and strategic outcomes. But the story matters because it illustrates how elite military formations die in modern warfare. Not in dramatic last stands or heroic final battles, but incrementally, consumed by attrition and superior resources. Panzer Lehr started as Germany's showcase armoured division, built from the best personnel and equipment available. They were destroyed in 2 months of combat, not because they fought poorly or made catastrophic tactical errors, but because they were facing enemy forces with material superiority and air supremacy in a strategic situation that was already lost. The instructors who died at Place de la Concorde and in Norman fields had taught German armoured doctrine for years. They understood combined arms warfare, mobile operations, concentration of force at decisive points. All of that knowledge became useless when the strategic picture was collapsed, when Allied air forces could destroy any concentration of German armour, when numerical superiority made tactical excellence irrelevant. This is what total war does to professional military forces. It consumes expertise. It makes quality irrelevant through quantity. It reduces elite formations to scattered remnants fighting in bad tactical situations with no hope of success. The Panther burning at Place Concord was just one tank, crewed by men whose names are mostly lost. But it represented the death of Germany's attempt to win through military excellence, the final proof that expertise and training couldn't overcome industrial production and strategic reality. Paris celebrated its liberation on August 25th, when von Coltitz formally surrendered. General de Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées to Notre Dame Cathedral, surrounded by massive crowds, reasserting his leadership of France and France's place among the Allied powers. The photographs from that day show joy and relief. A city that had been occupied for 4 years was free. French troops had participated in their own liberation. The humiliation of 1940 had been partially erased, but liberation had its dark side. Women accused of collaboration, often on thin evidence, were dragged into streets and had their heads shaved in public rituals of humiliation. Men suspected of working with the occupation authorities faced summary execution. The line between justice and revenge was blurred. France would spend years processing the trauma of occupation and defeat, trying to determine who had collaborated and who had resisted, who deserved punishment and who deserved rehabilitation. The easy moral clarity of Liberation Day would give way to complicated questions about collective responsibility and individual guilt. The burned-out Panther at Place de la Concorde was cleared away in the cleanup. The German crew, those who'd been captured rather than killed, went to prisoner of war camps. They joined thousands of other German prisoners from the Normandy campaign and the liberation of France. Most were eventually repatriated to Germany after the war ended. What they thought about their service in Panzer Lehr, about fighting in Paris, about the war they'd lost, isn't recorded in any accessible source. The instructors from the tank schools, the men who'd formed Panzer Lehr Division, were mostly dead by September 1944. Killed in action in Normandy, killed by Operation Cobra, killed in the Falaise Pocket, killed in Paris. A few survived and were captured. A very few made it back to Germany and continued serving until the surrender in May 1945. But the collective expertise, the institutional knowledge that had been concentrated in that one division was gone, destroyed not in a single catastrophic battle, but ground down over weeks of combat against an enemy with superior resources. This was Germany's fundamental problem in 1944. The Wehrmacht could still field competent units. Individual German soldiers and commanders often displayed tactical skill and determination. But tactical competence couldn't overcome strategic failure. Germany was fighting enemies with greater industrial capacity, larger populations, secure supply lines, and air superiority. The war was lost at the strategic level, and no amount of tactical excellence could change the outcome. Panzer Lehr Division demonstrated this truth clearly. They were as good as German armoured forces could be in 1944. They had the best equipment, the most experienced personnel, the strongest institutional knowledge, and they lasted 2 months in combat before being effectively destroyed. Not because they fought poorly, but because the enemy could absorb losses and replace them while Germany couldn't. Because Allied air forces could attack German positions with impunity while German forces moved only at night to avoid detection. Because the strategic situation made tactical success meaningless. The Panther at Place de la Concorde, burning in the August sun while Paris celebrated around it, was the visual representation of this dynamic. An excellent tank, probably crewed by experienced men, destroyed in a situation where excellence didn't matter. Immobilized by a long-range shot, finished off by ramming and white phosphorus, the crew killed or captured while trying to escape. All the training and expertise that had gone into creating Panzer Lehr Division ended with scattered tanks burning in cities they had no reason to be in, crewed by men whose knowledge had become irrelevant. The smoke from that burning Panther rose over Paris for hours, visible from kilometers away, a marker of regime change and the end of occupation. It dissipated eventually, carried away by wind, leaving just the wreck of the tank and the bodies of its crew. The square was cleaned up. The war moved on. Allied forces continued east into Germany. the Wehrmacht continued to collapse. The details of one tank engagement in Paris became a footnote in larger histories that covered army groups and strategic offensives. But for the men who died in that Panther, the engagement was everything. It was the final moment of their war, the end of whatever service they'd given to Germany's cause. They'd probably enlisted or been drafted years earlier, trained at armoured schools, learned their trade from the instructors who would later form Panzer Lehr, fought on various fronts, survived long enough to be selected for an elite division, deployed to Normandy with hopes that their expertise and equipment might make a difference, watched their division be destroyed by forces they couldn't counter, retreated across France with the remnants, ended up in Paris through some combination of orders and chaos, and died in a burning tank in a city that hated them for a cause that was already lost. Their deaths changed nothing strategically. Paris would have been liberated whether that Panther had been there or not. The war would have ended the same way. But individually, their deaths mattered, at least to them and to whatever families they left behind in Germany. They were men who found themselves on the wrong side of history, serving a regime that had started a war it couldn't win, dying in a tactical situation they'd been trained to recognize as hopeless. The instructors from Panzer Lehr who survived the war, who were captured or who made it back to Germany, had to live with the knowledge that their expertise had been wasted. They'd spent years training to be the best, forming a division that was supposed to demonstrate German armoured superiority. Instead, they'd been ground down in 2 months of defensive fighting, their skills made irrelevant by strategic bombing and material superiority. The survivors had to watch Germany lose the war they'd fought to win, see their country occupied and divided, process the moral implications of the regime they'd served. But in August 1944, those complications were still in the future. What existed was simpler. A burning Panther at Place de la Concorde, German crew dead or captured, French forces securing the square, civilians emerging cautiously to see if the occupation was really over. The immediate moment, stripped of context and consequences, was just combat. Metal against metal, fire and smoke, men dying in ways that were brutal and final. The Panther burned until there was nothing left to burn. The fire consumed the interior, destroyed whatever equipment hadn't been damaged in combat, rendered the vehicle a wreck. French troops examined it once the fire died down, looking for intelligence or souvenirs. They found little. The white phosphorus had done its work. What remained was scrap metal that would eventually be hauled away and melted down for recycling. The tank that had represented Germany's armoured elite vanished into the industrial process that had defeated it, reduced to raw material for some other purpose. Place de la Concorde returned to its normal function. The barricades were cleared, the burned vehicles were towed away, the cobblestones were cleaned. By September, you could walk across the square and see little evidence that a tank battle had occurred there. The city absorbed the damage and moved forward as cities do, the immediate past becoming history, history becoming memory, memory fading into the general knowledge that Paris had been liberated in August 1944, and the details didn't matter much to anyone except those who'd been there. The death of Panzer Lehr Division, spread across Norman fields and Parisian squares, represented the death of German military ambitions in Western Europe. The instructors were gone, the expertise was consumed. The elite formation that was supposed to demonstrate German superiority had been destroyed by enemies with better resources and clearer strategic vision. What remained of Germany's military power would continue fighting for 9 more months, but the outcome was determined. The burning Panther at Place de la Concorde was just one marker among thousands, one specific moment when the general collapse became visible in a specific location to specific witnesses.